The three-star general slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, roaring for the military police to cuff the insolent woman in unmarked fatigues. But as the MPs lunged, her tactical jacket slipped, revealing a classified sealed trident affixed to her shoulder, and the entire command center froze in absolute, breathless terror. The subterranean Joint Operations Center beneath Fort Liberty was a fortress of humming servers, glowing tactical displays, and the stifling ego of high-ranking military brass. It was an environment where rank was sacrosanct and protocol was absolute. Lieutenant General Arthur Kavanaugh stood at the head of the massive obsidian glass conference table, his chest heavily decorated with the ribbons of a career forged in conventional warfare. He was a man who demanded absolute obedience, his booming voice echoing off the reinforced concrete walls as he outlined the final phases of Operation Midnight Anvil. The Constellus mercenary splinter cell has entrenched themselves in the northern sector of the Al-Shabaab-controlled territory, Kavanaugh announced, using a laser pointer to trace a jagged red path on the satellite imagery projected against the far wall. Our Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel drones have confirmed their primary munitions cache is located in this subterranean bunker. We will initiate a simultaneous halo jump with Delta Force operatives, secure the perimeter, paint the target for a JDAM strike, and extract via the eastern ridge before the local militia even knows we breached their airspace. Around the table, colonels, intelligence directors, and senior advisors nodded in synchronized agreement. The plan was textbook. It was aggressive, loud, and bore the unmistakable, heavy-handed signature of General Kavanaugh. But in the shadowed corner of the room, sitting perfectly still in a steel folding chair, was a woman who had not nodded once. Evelyn Cross wore standard-issue desert fatigues. Her tactical fleece jacket was zipped up to her collar, completely devoid of name tapes, unit patches, or rank insignia. To the uninitiated eye, she looked like a low-level civilian intelligence contractor or a misplaced logistics liaison who had wandered into the wrong high-level briefing. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian braid, and her slate-gray eyes were locked onto the satellite projection with an icy, calculating intensity. "With all due respect, General," Evelyn's voice cut through the stuffy silence of the room. It wasn't a loud voice, but its calm, unyielding resonance possessed a gravity that immediately commanded the space. "Your men will be dead before they clear the first compound." The Joint Operations Center went dead silent. The hum of the cooling fan suddenly sounded deafening. Heads snapped around to stare at the corner. Major Richard Hughes, Kavanaugh's fiercely loyal aide-de-camp, dropped his pen on the table. General Kavanaugh slowly lowered his laser pointer, his face darkening into a deep shade of crimson. He leaned forward, bracing his knuckles against the mahogany table, his eyes narrowing at the woman in the shadows. "Who the hell are you? And who authorized a civilian analyst to speak during a Tier 1 operational brief?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the faint light of the monitors catching the sharp angles of her jaw. "The thermal blooms your Sentinel drone picked up aren't from a munitions cache, General. They are venting exhausts for a centralized server farm. If you bomb that bunker, you destroy the only hard drives containing the encryption keys to the Splinter Cell's offshore accounts. Furthermore, the eastern ridge you plan to use for extraction is a fatal choke point. The terrain analysis provided by your General Dynamics contractors failed to account for the seasonal monsoon mudslides. Your quick reaction force won't be able to reach your operators. You are sending Delta into a tactical kill box." Kavanaugh's jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. The audacity of this nameless woman was beyond insubordination. It was a direct assault on his authority in front of his entire command staff. "Major Hughes," Kavanaugh barked, his voice dripping with venom, "find out who this woman's commanding officer is. I want her stripped of her security clearance, escorted off this base, and brought up on federal espionage charges for accessing classified operational data without authorization." "I don't have a conventional commanding officer, General," Evelyn replied evenly, finally standing up from the metal chair. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, and entirely lacking the nervous energy of someone who was about to be arrested. "And you cannot execute Operation Midnight Anvil because my team has already been authorized to infiltrate that compound quietly, clone the drives, and neutralize the high-value targets without dropping a single JDAM." "Your team?" Kavanaugh laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You're a contractor. A keyboard warrior who thinks reading satellite telemetry gives you the right to dictate combat operations to a 3-star general. I don't care who you slept with at the Pentagon to get into this room, but your presence here is a breach of national security." Evelyn's eyes turned dangerously cold. The casual misogyny didn't anger her, it merely confirmed what she already knew about the dinosaur standing at the head of the table. "My clearance exceeds your operational jurisdiction, General. You need to stand down." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. No one spoke to General Kavanaugh that way. No one. "Military police," Kavanaugh roared, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the water glasses rattled. The heavy steel doors of the briefing room swung open, and 4 heavily armed military police officers rushed inside, their hands instinctively dropping to their sidearms. "Arrest this woman," Kavanaugh ordered, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. "Detain her for immediate interrogation by CID. Cuff her. Now." The MPs advanced, their faces grim and professional. They flanked her on both sides, unhooking the tactical restraints from their belts. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them," the lead MP commanded, reaching out to grab her wrist. Evelyn didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held her ground, her posture shifting imperceptibly into a balanced, combat-ready stance that only a highly trained operator would recognize. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thick, like the moments just before a shockwave hits. "I strongly suggest," Evelyn said softly to the MP reaching for her, "that you do not touch me." The lead MP hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instinct screaming that the woman standing before him was not a frightened analyst, but an apex predator coiled to strike. But General Kavanaugh was watching, his face flushed with tyrannical rage. "I gave you an order, Sergeant," Kavanaugh bellowed. "Put her in irons." The MP lunged. Evelyn moved with a blinding, kinetic fluidity that defied logic. She didn't strike him, but merely redirected his kinetic energy, pivoting sharply and catching his wrist. In the blink of an eye, she had twisted his arm into a brutal, agonizing compliance hold, forcing him to his knees without breaking a sweat. The other 3 MPs drew their tasers and sidearms, aiming directly at her chest. "Stand down!" Major Hughes yelled, drawing his own sidearm. "Let him go!" Evelyn released the MP, stepping back into the harsh overhead light of the briefing room. As she moved, her hand went to the heavy tactical zipper of her unmarked fleece. With a sharp, deliberate pull, she unzipped the jacket and let it slide off her shoulders, revealing the desert digital camouflage blouse underneath. There, affixed to the Velcro on her left shoulder, a customized placement reserved for the absolute highest tier of covert Black Ops detachments, gleamed a subdued, solid gold insignia. An eagle clutching a flintlock pistol, a trident, and an anchor. The special warfare insignia. The seal Trident. Right below it sat an even more terrifying piece of fabric. The unmistakable Crusader cross shield of the Joint Special Operations Command, with the letters DevGru stitched in dark, blood-red threading. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6. The MPs froze, their weapons wavered. Major Hughes lowered his sidearm, the color draining entirely from his face. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The men in the JOC were seasoned military professionals. They knew the myths, the ghosts of the JSOC community. But a female SEAL, it was an impossibility. It was a phantom. Kavanaugh stared at her shoulder, his jaw going slack before his rage ignited into something far more dangerous: denial. "Stolen valor," Kavanaugh hissed, stepping away from the table. "You're wearing a trident. You are wearing the insignia of the United States Navy SEALs. That is a federal offense, you imposter. No woman has ever made it through Bud S. No woman has ever been pinned into the teams, let alone DevGru." Evelyn reached into her breast pocket. The MPs tensed, but she slowly withdrew a solid black cryptographic identification card, a Presidential Emergency Action Document, PEAD badge. She tossed it onto the mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop, directly in front of the general. "Run the barcode, Arthur," Evelyn said, entirely dropping his rank. "Use the secure DARPA terminal, not the standard DoD network, the DARPA terminal." Kavanaugh glared at her, but gestured sharply to his communications officer. The young lieutenant grabbed the black card with trembling hands, slotting it into the highest security terminal in the room. As the machine whirred, Evelyn's mind briefly flashed back to the agony that had earned her that Golden Eagle 3 years ago at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, Bud S. Class 351. The Department of Defense had initiated a highly classified Black Book program to integrate a female operative into Tier 1 units for deep cover infiltration missions in the Middle East, where a male operator would instantly be compromised. She remembered the freezing, relentless crush of the Pacific Ocean during surf torture, the feeling of the 300-pound log crushing her collarbone during log PT, the instructors who pushed her twice as hard, actively trying to break her, hoping she would walk over to the brass bell and ring it 3 times to quit. She remembered Hell Week, 120 hours of continuous physical trauma, sleep deprivation, and hypothermia. She had fractured 2 ribs on day 3. She had taped them tightly, swallowed the blood in her mouth, and kept running the obstacle course. Out of 140 men, only 12 graduated. Evelyn Cross was one of them. Because her existence as a female SEAL was deemed a catastrophic operational security risk if leaked, her graduation was entirely classified. She was not put on public rosters. She was immediately ghosted into the deepest, darkest echelons of DevGru, answering only to the Secretary of Defense and the JSOC commander. She became the military's ultimate phantom, a weapon nobody knew existed, operating in plain sight. The DARPA terminal in the JOC chimed. A massive, blaring red banner flashed across the main projection screen, replacing the satellite imagery of the Horn of Africa. Clearance level. Yankee White, top secret psi name, Cross. Evelyn rank. Lieutenant Commander Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGru, Task Force Omega Authority, Override Directive 7, a Secretary of Defense. The silence in the room was absolute. Major Hughes looked like he was going to be sick. The MPs slowly holstered their weapons, taking several respectful steps backward, their eyes wide with awe and sheer terror at the woman they had just tried to physically assault. General Kavanaugh stared at the screen, his chest heaving, the reality of the situation slowly crushing his arrogance. A Yankee White clearance with a presidential override directive meant that in this room, regarding this specific theater of war, she outranked him. "You," Kavanaugh stammered, pointing at the screen, then at her. "You're a phantom. This program was a rumor, a myth." "I assure you, General, I am very real," Evelyn said, stepping up to the table. She picked up her black ID card and slipped it back into her pocket. "And my team is currently sitting in a C-17 Globemaster on the tarmac at Camp Pendleton, waiting for my signal to deploy. We are going to Halo jump into that compound, retrieve the encryption drives, and vanish before the Constellus guards even finish their midnight patrols." She leaned over the table, her face inches from Kavanaugh's, her slate gray eyes boring into his soul. "I am officially taking command of Operation Midnight Anvil. Your men are standing down. If you interfere with my operational theater, General, I won't have you arrested. I will have you court-martialed for treason under the Patriot Act." Kavanaugh stood frozen, his authority shattered in a matter of minutes by a woman who officially did not exist. He looked around the room. His colonels, his intelligence officers, his own aide, none of them would meet his eyes. They were all staring at the gold trident gleaming on Evelyn's shoulder. "You have the room, Lieutenant Commander," Kavanaugh whispered, his voice completely defeated. Evelyn turned to the communications officer. "Get me a secure uplink to JSOC Command. We're going hunting." 30,000 feet above the unforgiving, arid expanse of the Horn of Africa, the interior of the Boeing C-17 Globemaster III was bathed in the blood-red glow of tactical jump lights. The air inside the unpressurized fuselage was bitterly cold, hovering well below freezing, and carried the metallic scent of aviation fuel and ozone. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Cross stood near the edge of the yawning hydraulic ramp, peering down into the pitch-black abyss. The roar of the 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines was deafening, but inside her tactical helmet, the comms channel was perfectly silent. Behind her stood the 3 other members of Task Force Omega, Chief Petty Officer Brody Sullivan, a hulking breacher carrying enough C4 to level a city block, Senior Chief Jackson Pierce, the team's communications and signals intelligence expert, and Petty Officer First Class Wyatt Cole, a sniper whose proficiency with a Barrett MRAD was the stuff of JSOC legend. They were ghosts, stripped of all identifying markers, Clad in adaptive camouflage and wearing advanced GPNVG, 1/8 panoramic night vision goggles that gave them the appearance of four-eyed predators. Evelyn raised her hand, extending 2 fingers, 2 minutes to the drop zone. Her mind was razor sharp, compartmentalizing the confrontation with General Kavanaugh at Fort Liberty. The arrogance of conventional commanders often cost lives, but tonight, her team would execute the surgical precision that DevGru was designed for. The Constellus mercenary splinter cell they were hunting was comprised of ex-Special Forces operators from across the globe who had gone rogue, utilizing heavily fortified infrastructure to launder dark money for warlords. They were professionals, which meant they would be expecting a loud, aggressive breach exactly the kind Kavanaugh had planned. They would never expect 4 phantoms dropping from the stratosphere. The red light above the ramp snapped to a brilliant, blinding green. Evelyn stepped off the edge into the void. The wind hit her like a physical blow, a freezing shockwave that violently buffeted her body as she accelerated to terminal velocity. At 130 miles per hour, the high-altitude low opening, Halo Freefall, was an exercise in absolute atmospheric dominance. Below her, the hostile territory was a sea of ink, save for the faint, isolated thermal blooms of the mercenary compound miles ahead. She checked her wrist-mounted altimeter. 20,000 feet. 10,000 feet. 5,000 feet. At exactly 4,000 feet, Evelyn pulled her ripcord. The rectangular ram air parachute deployed with a violent jolt, arresting her descent. Around her, 3 smaller black canopies blossomed against the starlit sky as Sullivan, Pierce, and Cole flawlessly executed their canopy stacks. They glided in absolute silence, navigating via GPS waypoints toward the target, a heavily disguised subterranean bunker built into the side of a rocky escarpment. They touched down in a dry wadi 300 meters north of the compound, the soft sand absorbing the impact of their landings. Within seconds, the parachutes were gathered, buried, and concealed beneath the arid brush. Evelyn unslung her suppressed Heckler and Koch HK 416 assault rifle, the weapon feeling like a natural extension of her arm. Omega-1, comms check, Evelyn whispered into her L3 Harris tactical headset. Omega-2, green, Sullivan rumbled. Omega-3, green, Pierce affirmed, tapping the ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook strapped to his chest rig. Omega-4, situated, Cole replied. The sniper had already broken away from the main element, scaling a treacherous crag overlooking the compound to provide overwatch. Evelyn signaled the advance. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized fluidity of apex predators. Through the phosphor-green tint of her night vision, Evelyn identified the perimeter defenses. It wasn't just razor wire and standard patrols. The Constellus rogues had deployed high-end Raytheon ground surveillance radar modules and seismic sensors gear that General Kavanaugh's intelligence team had completely missed. If Delta Force had fast-roped in, the alarms would have triggered before their boots hit the dirt, turning the landing zone into a slaughterhouse. Pierce, spoof the seismic net, Evelyn ordered, dropping to a knee behind a rusted outcropping of rocks. Pierce moved forward, retrieving a small, customized signal cloning device from his tactical vest. He bypassed a junction box buried near the fence line, his fingers flying across the keypad, injecting a localized feedback loop. The seismic sensors are blind for the next 20 minutes. We have a window. They advanced to the primary entry point, a reinforced steel blast door guarded by 2 mercenaries smoking Russian cigarettes. Evelyn held up a fist to halt Sullivan and Pierce. She drew her suppressed combat knife. Moving with impossible stealth, she slipped through the shadows, flanking the guards. The gravel beneath her boots remained silent. In 2 blindingly fast motions, she neutralized the sentries, guiding their bodies quietly to the ground before they could even reach for their radios. "Clear," she whispered over the comms. Sullivan stepped up to the blast door, analyzing the electronic locking mechanism. Instead of explosive charges that would wake the entire valley, he pulled out a thermal lance. In 60 seconds, the locking pins were melted into slag. Evelyn pushed the heavy steel door open, the sterile, humming coolness of the subterranean server farm washing over them. They were in. But as they descended the concrete stairwell into the belly of the facility, the hairs on the back of Evelyn's neck stood up. The operational silence was too perfect. The tactical puzzle was missing a piece, and as a Navy SEAL, she knew that when a target felt too soft, you were already walking into a trap. The server room was a cavernous expanse of blinking blue lights and heavily shielded data racks. The air conditioning roared, masking the subtle sounds of Task Force Omega moving methodically through the aisles. This was the nerve center of the rogue operation, housing the encryption keys that unlocked billions of dollars in illegal arms transactions and mercenary bounties. "Pierce, get on the main terminal. You have 7 minutes to clone those drives," Evelyn commanded, taking up a defensive posture near the primary corridor. Pierce jacked his toughbook into the central mainframe, bypassing the initial firewall with a custom DARPA decryption algorithm. Lines of code cascaded down his screen in a dizzying waterfall of data. Sullivan covered the rear flank, his heavy machine gun trained on the stairwell. "Commander," Pierce whispered, his voice tense over the internal comms. "You need to see this." Evelyn kept her rifle raised, but backed up to where Pierce was kneeling. "Talk to me. Do we have the offshore routing numbers?" "I have the routing numbers, but that's not the problem," Pierce replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate a specific cluster of data. "Look at the source of the recent wire transfers funding this splinter cell. These aren't coming from local warlords or foreign cartels. The money is originating from a shell corporation tied to a defense contracting firm in Virginia. And look at the metadata on these encrypted emails." Evelyn squinted at the screen. Her blood ran cold. The encrypted messages warning the Constellus mercenaries of incoming drone surveillance and potential military strikes carried the digital signature of a secure DoD server. Specifically, a server located beneath Fort Liberty. It's an inside job, Evelyn realized, the sickening truth washing over her. The mercenaries weren't just a rogue splinter cell. They were a black market asset being protected by someone within the United States military command structure, Kavanaugh. He didn't want to bomb this bunker to destroy the enemy. He wanted to bomb it to destroy the evidence. He's on their payroll. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the server room snapped off, plunging the facility into absolute darkness. Red emergency strobes began to pulse, and the deafening shriek of a klaxon alarm tore through the air. "We've been made!" Sullivan yelled over the alarm, raising his weapon. "Cole, status!" Evelyn shouted into her comms. "Commander, you have 24 heavily armed tangos converging on the primary entrance." Cole's voice crackled from his overwatch position. "They bypassed the perimeter. They knew you were inside. Someone just sent an encrypted burst transmission directly to their command network." Kavanaugh. The general had realized Evelyn's override gave her access to the data that would hang him for treason. He had tipped off the mercenaries from the JOC in a desperate bid to have Task Force Omega wiped out, burying his secrets with them. "Pierce, rip the drives out. We don't have time to clone," Evelyn ordered, her combat instincts taking over. "Sullivan, rig the mainframe with incendiaries. We leave them nothing." Gunfire erupted from the stairwell. High-caliber rounds sparked against the server racks, sending shattered plastic and silicon flying. Evelyn returned fire with lethal mechanical precision, her HK-416 barking in 3-round bursts. Through her night vision optics, she watched 2 mercenaries drop, instantly neutralized by her suppressed fire. But more were pouring into the corridor, laying down suppressing fire that pinned the seals behind the fragile server banks. "Drives secured," Pierce yelled, shoving the heavy hard drives into his waterproof tactical pack. "Mainframe is rigged. 10-second fuse," Sullivan roared. "We blow the back wall. Exfil through the aqueduct," Evelyn commanded. The Eastern Ridge extraction was a death trap. She knew that from her satellite analysis. But the blueprints had shown an old, dry irrigation aqueduct behind the secondary wall. Sullivan slammed a breaching charge against the reinforced concrete at the rear of the room. "Fire in the hole." The explosion was a deafening, concussive wave that blew a massive hole into the rock face, revealing the dark, echoing tunnel of the aqueduct. Evelyn laid down a final wall of suppressing fire, dropping another mercenary who rounded the corner before diving through the breached wall. Pierce and Sullivan followed instantly. Behind them, Sullivan's incendiaries detonated, engulfing the server room in a localized firestorm of white phosphorus that melted the remaining hard drives into unrecognizable slag. The 3 operators sprinted down the pitch-black aqueduct, their night vision guiding them through the treacherous, uneven terrain. Above ground, Cole provided covering fire, his heavy Barrett sniper rifle booming in the distance, systematically dismantling the mercenary pursuit vehicles before they could even start their engines. 30 minutes later, Task Force Omega emerged 3 miles away from the compound, linking up with Cole at the designated emergency exfil coordinates. Ahead heavily modified Sikorsky MH-60 Blackhawk swooped down from the night sky, its side-mounted miniguns tracking the empty desert. The team piled into the chopper, the doors sliding shut as the aircraft banked hard and vanished into the darkness. 48 hours later, the doors to the Joint Operations Center at Fort Liberty swung open. General Kavanaugh stood at the head of the mahogany table, pale and sweating. He wasn't giving a briefing. He was surrounded by heavily armed agents from the Army Criminal Investigation Division. Evelyn Cross walked into the room, wearing her unmarked civilian fleece. She didn't say a word. She simply walked up to the table, pulled the encrypted hard drive from her pocket, and dropped it right in front of him. Kavanaugh stared at the drive, the final nail in his coffin, his career and life completely destroyed by the phantom he had tried to arrest. Evelyn turned her back on the disgraced general, walking out of the JOC and disappearing back into the shadows where she belonged. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Cross proved that the most dangerous warriors in the United States military aren't the ones standing in the spotlight. They are the unseen phantoms operating in the darkest corners of the world, protecting our nation from threats, both foreign and domestic. If you were captivated by this incredible, pulse-pounding story of tactical brilliance, defiance, and ultimate justice, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life military operations.